All right, great. Thank you very much, Bryce. And welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for this important topic, creating inclusive environments where all individuals can learn, have a sense of belonging, and thrive is really important to overall well-being. And we're fortunate tonight to have Dr. Elise Settani talk with us about inclusion practices. Dr. Settani earned her bachelor's in psychology and a master's in special education from Penn State University. And in 2024, she earned her PhD in special education from Lehigh University. She's been a board certified behavior analyst since 2019, and she serves as a lead clinician and supervisor in the Lehigh University Autism Services, which is an organization that's associated with the College of Education and provides direct services to young children with autism and their families. Her interests are in inclusion of children with special needs across all kinds of settings, both in homes and schools and in community settings. And she is going to share her expertise and insights with us tonight. Thank you so much, Elise.
Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here and to everyone who's joining us. I am beyond excited to talk to you all about a topic that is just really near and dear to my heart tonight with inclusion. I'm going to give a brief overview of our agenda. I'm going to just quick introduction since that was already covered, so you can see sort of where I'm coming from and how I ended up in this area. I'd like to go over just a background on autism and autism stigma, and then get into how that stigma is addressed and how we can take those strategies and put them into the classroom, as well as some final thoughts. So, as mentioned, I'm alumni from Penn State and Lehigh. And during that time, since I finished with my master's, I've worked both as a board certified behavior analyst and as a special education teacher. And so I really drew on my experiences to develop this passion for inclusion and creating these environments that are truly a culture of inclusion rather than just being places where we are placing students and having them learn. So something that we see is that more students with autism are being educated in general education settings, but despite this increased time with their peers, they're still encountering stigma, more social isolation, and tend to have fewer reciprocal peer um, networks in their classrooms. And so it continues to be an issue for these students. They're being placed into these supposedly inclusive environments, but they're not really being included as a part of the culture of the classroom. So I want to break that down a little bit and first talk briefly about autism. And so, as many people, I'm sure most of you here know, autism is considered a spectrum disorder. And I want to move away from that linear spectrum and more towards the autism wheel concept of it. So where we have a bunch of different characteristics and features that different autistic individuals may have more or less of, really helping to create that unique individual. Among those, though, that are commonly cited would be some of those social differences, relational differences, as well as communication differences, which can contribute to some of the difficulties with social inclusion. The other thing we see is that students who are autistic, they're experiencing that social isolation, and these difficulties persist and may even accelerate as children age. So here we see a picture of a social network map. And what you see is when students have more reciprocal relationships, you see larger circles to represent them, you see more connections with their peers. And often when we look at these maps for autistic students, we see that they have few, if any, reciprocal relationships with their peers in their classes. And this is something that as they get older may even accelerate and and they may have even fewer of those reciprocal peer nominations of friendship, and they score lower on these scales of social network. Um, when you look at compare younger elementary to older elementary, there are differences in what those look like. So that brings us to the idea of inclusion, right? So merely placing children with autism in an inclusive environment does not in and of itself make the environment inclusive for all students or lead to better acceptance of autism. We need to be able to um, work on the environment and work with the individuals in it to make sure that we're promoting that culture of access, acceptance, participation, achievement for all students, and make sure that we're really fully facilitating the inclusion of students with autism. So we see that, I talked a bit about how some of the social difficulties or differences that autistic students may have may contribute some to their challenges socially. But we also see that the neurotypical students consistently report negative attitudes toward their peers who are autistic when we look at measures of attitude. Those poor attitudes persist across age groups. So that's seen in elementary through college age students. And one of the things that we notice is that there's some inconsistency with different characteristics or variables that may contribute to that. So, interestingly, students who have fewer support needs are actually rated lower than students who have more moderate or intensive support needs. So that means that the students with fewer support needs who are more likely to be included in those general education classrooms for more time during the day are actually going to be viewed less favorably than another student who may have more support needs. So something that's been done to address the stigma are these anti-stigma or autism stigma interventions. And so in the literature, we see that there's some variation in how the interventions are conducted or what each one is composed of specifically, but they all seem to have some of the same core components. And the first one would be education. And so this is education on autism, the symptoms, etiology, strategies, strengths of autism. So really just teaching kids about autism. And then the other part of the interventions was some type of contact. So whether that was indirect contact, where they are learning about just autistic people and seeing things from the viewpoint of autistic people, or direct contact, where they actually are having experiences with someone who is autistic. So we see those all come together to create these anti-stigma interventions that are then going to help to shift classroom culture. Um, so again, we're seeing so then how do we, I apologize, that slide got mixed in there. So how do we see this incorporated in the classroom, right? So there are a couple of things that need to be considered, especially when we talk about the education component. So the goals of the education should be to give the following information. Instructional content will vary based on student age, but really we want to be answering those first three questions: what, how, why, as well as provide strengths and strategies. So starting with what, how, and why, we want to teach the students about autism, describe autism, characteristics of autism, how someone might become autistic, what it might look or sound like. With younger students, you might simplify these concepts, right? So you might say that some people are born with something called autism. I actually have been teaching kindergarten and first graders the term neurodiversity and what it means. And they are all able to, at the end of a series of lessons, tell me the word neurodiversity and tell me what it means and use it appropriately. So you don't necessarily need to shy away from certain terms, but make sure that you're explaining them in an age appropriate way. The next thing you're going to do is ensure that students are also learning about strengths of autism. So much of what is talked about with autism is often focused on that deficit model. So here we want to emphasize, yes, there are some differences in how people might do things, and some of those differences are going to be strengths for autistic individuals. One of these you could teach about is a special interest, and how that special interest is a passion for an autistic person and how that can really make them an interesting person to talk to about it, a resource, and be very knowledgeable about that. And finally, you want to teach students strategies that they can use when they're going to be playing with their autistic peers or interacting with their autistic peers. So you can do this as part of like a more formal peer mediated intervention, or it can be less formal general strategies that you're giving to students. Some of the strategies that you could include would be how to gain attention, persisting in conversation, initiating conversations in play, redirecting to task. So there's some resources that are available related to teaching children about autism. So as always, and we're not going to watch this video, but just as an example, there are videos out there that are teaching about autism. And these ones here, the Intricate Mind series is autistic people who are talking about their experiences with autism. Um, the next one would be an existing curricula. And so there are a couple different curricula that exist already. One of them, for example, is the Kit for Kids. And so the Kit for Kids provides those different components that I talked about earlier, and brings them all together. And these are packaged lessons, and they have these available for all different age groups as well. The next thing to do would be to increase contact with autistic individuals. So I talked a bit earlier about direct contact versus indirect contact. So with direct contact, we're talking about experience with autistic individuals, whereas indirect contact would be exposure to autistic individuals. So think about that as direct contact is sort of live in person. Indirect contact is going to be representations of autism. So thinking about books, movies, videos. For the direct contact, in a couple ways, we can increase that direct contact. And the first would be using facilitated interactions. And so this might be having really purposeful peer partners where you are partnering students up in the class and you're rotating that, right? You're not always relying and putting the same two students together. You're not always having the same partner for an autistic student. You might have targeted group activities. So perhaps you're thinking about some, Susie, you're using an autistic child's special interest to create this targeted group activity to really entice other students to come and join and want to be a part of that activity. And you're creating this opportunity for them to interact with each other. Another could be something like a recess buddies type program. And again, play off of the strengths of all of the students, the autistic students and the neurotypical. Find things that they all enjoy doing and want to do and help them see that. Help them see their similarities so that they are seeing, oh, this is someone that I would want to play with outside. Another option would be guest speakers. This could be asking an older student to come in and talk about their experiences with autism. This could be reaching out to someone who's autistic in the community or someone who's autistic that you know to come in and talk with the class about their experiences. To increase indirect contact, we have options like books, and I'm going to go through these next couple slides quickly. They have examples of different books. So here are some picture books that are going to be about autism, that are going to be showing autistic characters. We also have middle grade books, young adult books, nonfiction books. Right. So as you can see, there are numerous books out there that are going to be providing that indirect contact. They're going to include main autistic characters that students can use to learn more about that autistic experience and to just learn more about autism in general. There are also plenty of TV shows out there that have autistic characters. In fact, the Pablo show that's on this slide is what's been used in the kit for kids as well. When you're going to increase that indirect contact, there's some things though that you want to look for. So you want to make sure that there is an autistic main character. So you want to have that so you can have just a really good, authentic representation that's centering autism rather than it being a side character. So what you might often find are stories that are written and the autistic character is a secondary character, like a sibling or a friend of the main character. And the main character is sharing their experience of being a friend to an autistic person. That's not going to help with the stigma, right? We want the autistic character to be the main character so that students are seeing that experience, they're having that contact with the autistic individual. Even better than one autistic character would be a story or a book or whatever type of media it is that has multiple autistic characters, two or more, right? So we want to see that as well. This really helps to provide a representation of the spectrum of the disorder and to show that, no, just like everybody else, there are no two autistic individuals who are the same. The third thing we want to look for are stories that are told from the autistic perspective. So, again, the idea here is to provide that experience and exposure to autism. And so, a really great way to do that is to have stories where it's someone who's autistic that's doing the storytelling, and things are through their perspective. And finally, when possible, try to use works that have been created by those who are within the autism community. We want these to be really authentic characterizations, and stories. So that is how you're going to get the most authentic representation. Um, so if we are able to address stigma head on, we're able to increase contact. We can use these strategies to create that culture of inclusion, to help put students together and give them and help create that sense of belonging for autistic students in the classrooms. All right. I talked really fast. I got to the end of my slides. So thank you guys so much. And just as Bryce said, we're aiming for 15 to 20 minutes. So I got
Yeah.
you there.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure you hit it right on the nose at least. So thank you for that presentation. So for our audience members, please use the chat to ask Dr. Settani any questions that you may have about the presentation, maybe situations or circumstances you've experienced where you're trying to create a more inclusive environment for your students who may be experiencing something similar to what we're seeing. Elise, kind of looking through your presentation, bless you, and kind of reflecting on not just the experience of making it more inclusive for students with autism, but it almost makes me feel like there's parallels here to kind of not necessarily direct discrimination, but there's certainly an aspect of individuals who are obviously experiencing something very different, whether it's from their mental status or from their race or nationality. So, and I think that you certainly hit it on the head of like the best way to combat that is ultimately exposure, getting to know them, getting to understand them, and having a reflective experience about what it might be like for somebody like that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something the anti-stigma research for autism, it borrows a lot from other areas of anti-stigma research. It borrows from racism research for kids. And so it's a lot of those parallel strategies. So I tell people I come at this from the viewpoint of someone who's doing, autism research, but I'm really looking to create just broadly culture shifts in classrooms so that, yes, we're going to, when I do some of the interventions, I'm teaching the strategies, I tell them, we've been talking about autism, but these are just really great ways to be a good friend.
Mhm.
That's how I phrase it to younger kids when we're talking about the different strategies they're learning. Because yes, we talked about ones related to autism today, but a lot of that can be shifted to talk about pretty much any topic. I think that your students need help with, and that would be beneficial for creating that culture in your classroom.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm trying to go through a few questions that I had pulled up to see what would be some ones that we can kind of work through. Let's see. So one of the things you had talked about was, kind of social isolation and how that kind of, kind of accelerates kind of not only from, elementary school years, but also through high school and college years. So why is it so difficult, do you think? I mean, it's a difficult subject to navigate as children are for many things that are complex, but beyond those exposures, like what specific recommendations could you kind of implement for, educators in the classroom that are trying to, make that social isolation a little bit lessened and kind of develop more of an environment that is accepting?
I think that's a great question. Yes, we have the exposure, and just really helping to initially facilitate
Hmm.
some of those interactions. So one of the activities I like to do with students is a similarities and differences activity. And so with that, I will, and again, my research is mostly in with younger elementary students, but I think that a lot of these things can be shaped for other age groups.
Mhm.
But doing a similarities and differences activity, for example, to get students thinking about how everybody is the same and different. So they see the teacher and myself model it at the front of the classroom, talk about how we're alike, how we're different, and then just having students practice that with each other. And part of that activity that I always incorporate is I tell students to ask each other what their favorite thing to play is.
Mhm.
And so there, I'm starting to set the stage for them for when they do go into those social interactions. Um, we have that icebreaker done. We know who likes to play what activities, and so they can use that to their benefit. And then the teacher is going to be circulating and talking and really hearing these too. And the teacher can help to facilitate some of that as well in the classroom. And we see, once the students start to develop those friendships, the research shows that like those continue to develop. And that by having just one or two students that have some of that social standing that are going to then become friends with this autistic student, we see that that autistic student's social standing also changes as well. And they have more reciprocal relationships with peers.
No, absolutely. So we did get a question come in from Estella. She wants to preface that the message is she is a college professor who's had some difficulty communicating with students who are struggling academically. What is the best way to communicate with them? I think that in an effort to try and keep that as wide as we can and trying to relate it back to the topic, particularly for faculty members or teachers who maybe have autistic students in their classrooms, trying to navigate and learn communication skills with those students, what are some strategies or some recommendations that you might make to support, the other side of the classroom, the
Yeah.
facilitator who's experiencing that.
Yeah, oftentimes in the teacher role, it's really helpful to just be direct, and to come at it in a very neutral but direct way for those situations, especially if it's a difficult topic.
Mhm.
Um, it's something to Temple Grandin talks a lot about this. She talks about her experiences and with having like telling people like you just need to tell me exactly what it is rather than trying to allude to an issue or sort of like go around it when you come in to something head on and are direct about it. And that's why some of the parallel social skills instruction that I might do with autistic students would be that very explicit of like, in these situations, this is what someone's sort of expecting. And I don't phrase it as like, this is what you need to do, just sort of what other people are expecting out of it. So that way, if they don't get the outcome they thought they were going to, they're like, oh, well, that's not, yeah, I didn't react in the way they expected. So this is how it might go. But yeah, direct, explicit communication, just being really
Okay.
clear.
All right. Wonderful. Something else I was thinking about is, so some of the curriculum that you had mentioned, about kind of integrating that into the curriculum. What is as a non-educator, what is a common time frame for, somebody who's looking to implement that into their classroom? Maybe they know that they're going to be having an autistic student come into their fold relatively soon. So kind of what type of a time frame should, they allot for kind of teaching this type of curricula and, allowing students to kind of process and digest it.
Yeah, I don't know how long the Kit for Kids one is. I don't know how many lessons it consists
Mhm.
of. I believe it's like a short units worth. I put units in quotes. So I've done it. The lessons I do are usually 4 lessons long. For
Mhm.
the units I do, it's four lessons that typically fit right in with the class's social emotional learning curriculum.
Mhm.
So we wait for a pause in some of the topics for that, and then I come in and teach it during, one week during their SEL time.
Mhm.
Um, I think the Kit for Kids, I believe, is sort of a similar time frame to that. Might be a little bit longer. It might be more like a 2 week curriculum or, a week and a half. But I don't think it doesn't need to be anything super drawn out or extensive.
Mhm.
In some of the research, a lot of the research, it's been between excuse me, like it's been all over the place for how long they are, but the average lengths would be around like 5 to 8 lessons from what I've
Mhm.
seen. And some of the older students get kind of more lessons because the lessons are a little more involved than in the young for the younger students. The thing to think about is that just like with any other content students are learning, there needs to be some type of maintenance work going on as well. So
Mhm.
reminders, periodic reminders about it. You're teaching strategies for when you're playing outside. Make that part of your routine before they go out to play. Like, oh, hey, don't forget to, look around and see if anyone's playing by themselves. And if they are, reach out to them.
Yeah, it's like small continuation
Yes,
strategies, so that way it's not just like, okay, we've talked about this for,
exactly.
6 or 8 lessons, and then we never talk about it again, and then a month and a half later, there's a situation where maybe a student is bullied, or not to
Exactly.
say that something like that would happen, but just as kind
Sure,
of a
but it
discrete example.
It absolutely could. And the other thing too is in your classroom library, incorporate those books that have autistic characters in them, right? Start to have those just to increase the diversity of the classroom library. In one of the ways to do that, have neurodiverse characters, have stories of that type, so that way when students are going to pick a book out of a classroom library, it's available for them and they can just grab it and read it and learn more and continue that exposure.
Mhm. So as the kind of understanding and like I really liked the example of the wheel in terms of autism being a spectrum. I think I like that from a visual standpoint because we understand that there's a lot of different presentations of autism and being on that spectrum. Um, and maybe this is too broad of a question, but like from a curricular standpoint on like a local or even a national level, like how many or from like maybe from a percentage standpoint, you know school districts or standards are being implemented where this is education that's actually being integrated into the classroom? Do you know? Like, has there been research or information about that?
There hasn't been any that I've found so far. I was trying to look for some of this to just see. I hear about it as like one-off lessons in
Hmm.
classrooms more often than anything really substantial, where kids get a packet that the teacher downloaded from Teachers Pay Teachers that is, a very quick, brief, and not very involved description of autism. Students color it in and take it home, and then it's not really talked about again. That's what I hear about more often than
Kind of
anything
like a
that's just
glazing over,
more.
like this is a
Yeah,
general
yeah,
introduction, but
exactly.
not comprehensive.
Yeah, and my goal is when I go in to work with teachers is that I'm running the lessons when I'm there, but I'm
Mhm.
also trying to give them all the tools they have so that way when I'm not there, the next year they have autistic students, or even if they don't have autistic students, they
Mhm.
can still incorporate all these strategies and they can still do all of this in their classrooms again the next year without me there.
All right, wonderful. All right, so we got a question from Shelley. So Shelley is an elementary reading specialist who works with many students who have varying degrees of struggles with reading, including students who have autism. How would you suggest helping a student who gets quote unquote stuck and refuses to try a new strategy? For example, I have a third grader who refuses to sound out words. I have a second grader who will act out when we were doing review drills. So, some really concrete examples of difficult situations that Shelley is experiencing. So, kind of looking at this in the very limited context that we have, like, what are your thoughts around it?
Yeah, it's a really challenging one to do and say, yes, this is what's going to work. I often find that when I'm going in and working with teachers on challenging behaviors or just navigating some of these situations like this, it's easier to get a broader sense of the student to find out what they like and don't like. I do find that some things generally that are helpful. First, then contingencies, first we're going to do this, then you can do that. Having schedules for what the expectations are, just so that's up front ahead of time. I love a token board for students, having them earn something they really like.
Gold star, gold star strategy.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. All of the strategies I will always do are going to be reinforcement based. That's my philosophical standpoint there is that, we should really be building up reinforcement, building up motivation. I see often when students don't want to do something, it's a motivation issue for them.
Hmm.
It's just their whatever is supposed to be the reward or the in behavioral terms we would call it the reinforcement is just not matching the effort that they have to put in.
Hmm.
So we either need to change the effort they have to put in so it matches the reward, or change the reward so it matches their effort.
Hmm.
So some of those are some of the biggest things. Sometimes that just giving the first then or giving the schedule ahead of time can be
Hmm.
really helpful for changing the effort that they have to put in because they know it's coming. And you can do the same thing, academic strategies. You can do it with the social piece as well, so that we are, if we're working with students, getting ready to go to recess, and they're not sure what to expect at recess. That's
Hmm.
where facilitating some of those groups, peer buddies too. I just thought that as well. Sometimes just peer buddies with academic, with social, with any of that can be really helpful in providing those expectations. It's my
Yeah.
like quick and dirty answer
Yeah.
to that question.
Yeah. And I think kind of as a follow-up to that, obviously these are very complex and difficult circumstances for educators to navigate. So if somebody has, more in-depth questions that they would like to connect with you on, what are you open to our audience reaching out to you and connecting and maybe having some further conversations?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. My email, I usually put my email on it. I use a different template. Usually my email is on the thank you slide, but it's not.
Yeah.
I am happy with my email, my Lehigh email being shared. I
Okay.
will tell
Why
you.
don't you drop it in the chat for
Yeah,
the audience and then they
perfect.
can pull it right there. So with that, so with the generous help of Gemini and artificial intelligence at times, so looking at programs like Recess Buddies and Pair Partners, you had mentioned wanting to really foster a true genuine friendship, rather than how do you ensure programs like that reinforce that type of dynamic rather than like a helper to helper hierarchy? Because I can see it from kids'
Yeah.
standpoints, obviously everybody wants to be friends, but then if you tell them like, hey, you're going to be partnered with Johnny here, and Johnny is, we're asking you kind of, voluntelling you
Yeah.
to be the student's friends. Like, how do you make sure that that hierarchy doesn't become a difficulty?
Yeah, that is absolutely concerned with some of these, especially when it's like that one-on-one buddy. So one of the ways that I like to do buddies is so that it's not the same person every time.
Hmm.
And so it's just everybody's getting partnered up on this activity. Everyone has a partner. This just happens to be your partner this time. With the like the recess, doing like a recess buddy or some of the more other facilitated interactions, it's volunteer based. It's everybody can opt in or opt out of doing it. The idea is that you're going to pick an activity that's going to be something that the autistic student really enjoys, and other kids are going to be like, "Whoa, that's super cool. I want to do that." And so it's encouraging the other students to opt in to doing it so that then you can start to maybe on both sides facilitate some of those interactions. Reminding the neurotypical students, hey, so and so has, you're doing chalk. So and so has all the chalk. So if you need some, you're going to have to ask them.
Hmm.
Or reminding all students, hey, remember, talk to each other about what you're drawing, or you can, ask each other questions, or don't forget to do this when you're playing. And so really, really trying to move away from the voluntold type of thing and increase, like I was saying, we always want to increase motivation. So make that
Hmm.
motivation there for students to want to be a part of that activity. You make it so undeniably fun that they're like, oh, I want to see what's going on over there and I want to be a part of that.
Hmm. Wonderful. And then, so looking at things like interaction strategies, you talking about the persistence in conversation, and maybe some specific cues that neurotypical students maybe struggle with when staying engaged with peers who are on the spectrum. So, what type of recommendations or specific cues can educators teach neurotypical students to help them stay engaged with their peers when things can become challenging?
Yeah, I like to start by just teaching that different people communicate in different ways. And
Mhm.
so covering a whole bunch of different modes of communication from using long, complex sentences and spoken language to single word spoken language pictures, AAC devices that will talk for students, sign language, and really expose them to all of that to
Hmm.
start so that first they have an understanding of the different modalities that communication can even take in the first place. And then once you've established that, you can then bring up some of the things that they might notice that are more like hallmark characteristics of autistic communication styles, such as limited eye contact, and let them know,
Hmm.
like, hey, your friend might not always look at you when you're talking to them, but you
Hmm.
might not always look at, if you're doing something, you might not look at them either. And pointing out things like that and just reminding them, like, if your friend doesn't respond, it's not that they, saying like it's not because they didn't want to respond, they probably didn't hear you.
Hmm.
And just reminding students, like, hey, make sure you're getting someone's attention first. Make sure that they are hearing you first. These are things I have to remind adults when they're working with autistic students too. They're like, oh, they're ignoring me. I'm like, they're not ignoring you. They have no idea you were talking to them. You didn't get their attention first. Like, my child
Yeah.
doesn't follow directions. I'm like, they do if you have their attention.
Right.
Um, so just little things like that of remind students, like, don't give up easily if someone doesn't respond the first time you say
Hmm.
something.
Yeah.
I find that kids tend to be a little more persistent actually in that than I see adults are.
Mm.
Um, because they tend to repeat question and repeat it, waiting for a response. Where I see adults sort of be like, oh, they're ignoring me more
Yeah.
quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. So, in kind of a change, or we'll say an adjustment in the direction a little bit. So, from an educator standpoint, if they're working in a school district or working in a school system that doesn't really integrate these types of lesson plans and curriculum, what would be, do you have any experience or recommendations for navigating those conversations with, higher ed administration, with the school districts and things of that nature? Because I can understand that there's probably places where this needs additional advocacy,
Mhm.
beyond just if it's not coming from the district, and it needs to come from the students, if there are circumstances where those are happening. Any recommendations or strategies or experiences that you've been in where you've needed to or you've worked with folks that have needed to advocate to incorporate this type of curriculum or experience?
I have been very fortunate in my own experiences. I have been working with teachers and admin who are very excited about this type of work.
Mhm.
I do know that the other side exists. It's seen as like one more thing to have to do or navigate or
Mhm.
work on. I think it's just really important to remind people that um, our goal is the least restrictive environment for autistic students, and putting them into a general education classroom where the other students, I've gone into schools when I've first started, and the neurotypical students didn't even recognize that the autistic student was in their class.
Mhm.
And so pointing out situations like that are occurring can be really powerful because you go in and the kid would walk in for excuse me, for certain activities and sit at a classroom in the back of the room, never interact with anybody. Their paraprofessional would support them in the academics, and they would get up and leave when that class period was over. And the rest of the class had no awareness of them as being of the autistic student as being part of the class. And so using some of those, that's an extreme example, but using
Mhm.
some of those examples of what can ultimately happen, and have these students saying, I don't know their name. They're not, I show them pictures of other class. I hear they're not in my class. I thought we were looking at pictures of kids in my class. And so that to me is a powerful thing to show that this is what can happen if we're not actually taking these measures to address the culture of inclusion and creating that environment in the classroom. Because again, technically on paper, they were an inclusion, but that's not
Mhm.
the least restrictive environment because they're not actually in contact with peers. They're
Yeah.
working one-on-one with a paraprofessional.
Well, and not even least restrictive, but not even
Yeah,
minimally supportive. Like, it's probably
yeah,
the bare minimum.
yes. It is on paper inclusion.
Mhm.
Um, and that's it. And so, I would argue that we're not meeting their right to the least restrictive environment at that point. And
Mhm.
so,
All right, wonderful. So we have one more question coming in from Marissa, excuse me. And this will probably be our final question for the night. So Marissa asks, I often run into one of the questions I often run into during my autism evaluation feedback appointments for autistic children with high support needs and significant social skill challenges is that parents are hesitant for placement of their children in an autism classroom. So parents end up feeling very worried and refuse to sign off on the IEP. One of the common worries is that I hear is that there is a child who won't have access to socialize with neurotypical peers slash other students who do have, quote, better developed social functioning. Any thoughts on how to encourage parents to both get the help for their child as well as encourage social progress in and out of the self-contained class?
It's a really hard thing, I think, for parents, especially when they are new to the diagnosis process, to fully understand that the IEP, when they come to the meeting, is a proposed plan. That is not set in
Mm,
stone. Parents always have the right to call an IEP meeting, and they can and should fight for changes in the IEP to make sure that their child is getting those interactions and getting that social inclusion. I personally don't like when it says they'll be included during things like lunch because often that means, again, going into the lunchroom, sitting at a separate table from their peers because classes often sit together. Um, and so so I would encourage people to encourage parents to fight for their children in those situations, even if it's uncomfortable.
be better advocates.
And to be an advocate and and bring examples of times, sometimes it starts with things like specials. Let's go to art, music, um, you know, gym, whatever it is, start there. And there's no reason that there aren't other activities that they can be going to with the class. And so getting that into the IEP is going to be really important. And it's a struggle. It can help to have someone like I've had to sit there with parents and be that person helping to advocate for that for the student because you will often get pushback because it does require more support from the school. It does require more planning. And I think that a lot of times there are people who feel overwhelmed by that on the teacher side. It's a lot. It can be overwhelming. And we really need to be doing what's best for these autistic students. And it shouldn't matter if, how are they going to learn those social skills that they need? How are they going to learn how to be in those environments if they're never in those environments?
Mhm.
And so that needs to be the argument that's made that you can't learn the skills needed to be around peers if you're never around peers.
Right. Yeah, going back to what you were talking about earlier about exposure and the importance of exposure for really for both parties, the neurotypical student and the student on the spectrum.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, it's a really tough situation to be in, and I've been in that one as well. It's really tough, and remembering that also call those additional meetings. So start off with maybe a little bit of inclusion, and then say, okay, we're going to revisit this in a couple of months, and things are going well. We're going to add more. Things are going well. Great. We're going to add more. We're going to add more. Um, you don't need to wait a whole year to
Mhm.
add more. You don't need, and reminding parents of their rights as the parent. Again, the meeting is to discuss and propose the IEP and develop it, not to be presented with a final product.
Yeah, absolutely. So on that note, we are at time. I do want to, thank Dr. Elise Settani for her time this evening and her preparation for the presentation. As somebody who knows very little about educating students on the spectrum, this was certainly very informative for me. Even though I'm not an educator and I don't have to apply these practices, it's definitely just very interesting conversation. I hope that our audience found some value in tonight's presentation. So if you have further questions or more in-depth questions that you didn't want to ask tonight, please reach out to Dr. Elise Settani and the College of Education at Lehigh. There's many educators and many researchers who are great resources for supporting you in the classroom. So with that, thank you all for taking the time this evening. And if there's any additional questions, then please feel free to reach out to us at Alumni Relations, as well as the College of Education. So thank you so much for your time and your attention, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, everyone.